into this towering shrine of Christendom, preserved for the glory of God, has gone the painstaking work of the great creators, the world's mighty men of art.
They told you Innocent III was the most powerful pope. Kings on leashes, emperors by letter, Europe moving when his seal hit wax. That's the textbook story. The paper trail is telling a harder one. He didn't just command, he calibrated. He used law like a lever and silence like a hammer. And when the hammer fell, it didn't always land where he aimed. Picture a winter conclave and a young canon lawyer stepping into light. Paris for theology, Bologna for law. A pen already sharp with treatises on human frailty, he takes the name Innocent and starts with a premise simple enough to fit on a seal. The office he holds has the plenitude of power. Not a slogan, a legal instrument. He writes as if the church is a court and Europe a case. If that sounds like bravado, hold the judgment and watch what happens when theory meets kingdoms. Start with sound, because policy can be heard. Bells in England, stop. No weddings sung, no public mass, a kingdom on interdict because a king rejected the Pope's choice for Canterbury. That's not theater. It's a pause in the calendar that grinds every village routine. Priests whisper absolution at deathbeds. Elsewhere, the liturgy falls silent. Markets still open, but without the usual blessings. Months pass, then years. The king holds his line until he doesn't. Excommunication follows. Pressure accumulates in 1,000 inconveniences and a few sharp losses. He yields and swears fealty. A crown becomes a papal fief, and legal theory walks into the royal chancery. If you want a clean triumph, you can stop the story there. If you want evidence, keep going. Open the documents around Runnymede. Barons squeeze concessions from a rattled monarch, and a charter appears with the ink still wet. It limits arbitrary power and spells out procedures in plain words. The Pope reads the terms and the method, granted at knife point from a sworn vassal, and annuls the charter. Legal logic? Clear. An agreement, made under duress, binds no one. Political outcome? Messy. The text that he voids will outlive them both. In the short run, he protects feudal order. In the long run, the annulment frames the charter as a thing worth fighting for. Power stumbles forward, but law keeps receipts. Put that result in your pocket. We're coming back to it. Shift to Germany. Two men claim the imperial throne, oaths crisscrossed like cracks in ice. He weighs promises, dangers, geography. He recognizes one claimant and writes conditions in careful clauses. When promises crack, he withdraws support and backs a younger prince from Sicily, with a head full of languages and a talent for delay. It looks like zigzag if you read it as mood. Read it as method, and you see choreography. A pope acting as arbiter of succession, binding kings with conditions, unbinding them when they stray. Every dispensation and censure creates a ledger of debts. Debts invite collection. How long can a referee keep playing before he becomes a participant? Set that aside, but don't drop it. Go south, where doctrine meets steel. In Languedoc, preachers find cold doors and bishops lack pull. Persuasion comes first, legations, public disputations, patient letters. Then a papal envoy is murdered on a riverbank, and the vocabulary switches to crusade. Armies gather, towns burn. A later chronicle gives a legate a sentence so brutal it became legend. Whether those exact words were spoken matters less than what happened next. Force substitutes for catechesis. The records we have, charters, depositions, confiscations, show a region remapped under banners. The question is not whether it happened, but whether it could have happened otherwise in the world he governed. The answer you choose says as much about you as it does about him. Now the East, where vows and money twist a holy plan. A preaching tour fills ships for Jerusalem and lands them in Venetian arithmetic. Debts come due. A Christian port becomes a target to pay the bill. He condemns the attack and excommunicates the army. They keep marching. A bargain is struck for a throne in Constantinople. It falls apart. A second bargain follows. The city is taken and stripped. Relics scatter across Europe like seeds in new reliquaries. He hadn't ordered the sack. He hadn't wanted Zara. He will still knit a church structure over the Latin Empire that follows, because leaving chaos is also a choice. People draw arrows from his letters to burning streets and call it intention. The paper does not support that. It supports something colder, an attempt to salvage order from outcomes he could not reverse without breaking more. Turn to a quieter lever that moves more weight than any battle. Marriage. A king in France sets aside his queen and takes another. It looks like a private scandal. It becomes a public case. He presses, patiently and firmly, through letters that cite law and conscience. The king yields and takes back his lawful wife. In Spain, another royal match violates degrees of kinship. A judgment arrives that unknits the union and redraws alliances. This is not gossip. It is governance by sacrament, a demonstration that law can be a shield for the vulnerable and a cage for the powerful. When kings discover that a wedding rung wrongly can be wrung back, they also learn that the ring is a ring of jurisdiction. Now turn inward, to a council that changed the texture of daily life. Bishops gather from across Christendom. Canons are drafted in a register hand that still reads clean today. The Eucharist is defined in words that end arguments. Every Christian is told to confess at least once a year and receive at Easter. Marriage is tightened into public form to stop clandestine unions. Bans, witnesses, visible consent. Clergy are reminded that preaching is not optional, that schools for the poor are not ornaments, that visitation is a duty. Abuses are named, remedies set. A crusade timetable is laid out along with a standardized levy on clerical income to fund it. In one dossier, the church steps closer to kitchens and bed frames, not only altars. If you want to know what reform looks like when it actually reaches households, watch how the calendar shifts after that council. Some canons show the seam where pastoral care frays into policing difference. Distinctive dress for Jews and Muslims is ordered in some regions to prevent confusion. On clean parchment, it reads like a bureaucratic safeguard. Under changing rulers, it becomes a badge that can be used to mark and exclude. The same hand that writes remedies can write lines that wound. Evidence is not here to save reputations, it is here to keep the picture whole. Holiness arrives not just in laws, but in people with bare feet. A merchant's son from Umbria brings a request that looks like a risk. Live without property, preach repentance in the marketplace, obey in simplicity. He listens, hesitates, gives provisional blessing, and asks for safer framing later. A new kind of religious life moves from alley to altar with cautious permission. Another preacher organizes study, preaching, and poverty with disciplined, law-minded zeal, and will receive formal recognition from the next pope. The gate still opened here. Institutions do not always invent their future. Sometimes they consent to it. Walk the papal states, and you see the other side of centralization. Legates carry defined authority, sealed in briefs. Appeals rise from far dioceses to a single court. Notaries standardize forms. A chancery becomes Europe's most efficient paper mill. Plenitude of power is not a boast. It is a workflow. Church speaks law in a single grammar, and parishes far from Rome begin to feel Rome's hand in predictable ways. Predictability is power's quiet cousin. The same form that confirms a bishop's election confirms a village right-of-way. The same court that hears a king's complaint hears a clerk's appeal. When you standardize the path to justice, you also standardize the habit of knocking on Rome's door. Money makes ideals move. Read the letters that set fixed shares of clerical income aside for crusade over a set term. The numbers are less important than the idea. A universal levy managed by legates and collectors who answer to Rome. Exemptions are granted and revoked. Delays are permitted and punished. You are watching fiscal centralization grow out of spiritual aims. Even those who dislike the tax accept the principle that a general cause can bind local purses. That acceptance will matter later, in ways no one in the drafting room can see. Myth likes to crowd out detail, so clear some space. People say he planned the sack of Constantinople. The sequence of letters says he forbade the detour, punished the first wrong turn, and then tried to govern a fait accompli without pretending it was holy. People say he invented papal absolutism from nothing. The record shows he inherited tools, sharpened them, and described them with a clarity that others could quote. People say he smothered reform. The approvals and conditions he gave to new forms of religious life say he fenced it into something the old system could survive. You can dislike the fence and still admit it kept the fire inside the hearth. If you want to see method, not legend, read him the way archaeologists now read ruins. Not for statues, but for soot. Look at the interdict's local effects. Parish processions skipped, marriages delayed, baptisms moved behind doors, and you see how spiritual sanctions translate into social pressure. Look at crusade letters, formulae, exemptions, timetables, and you see crusading as a fiscal and legal system as much as a sermon. Look at council canons, on confession, marriage, preaching, and you see behavior change by repetition, not shock. Look at an annulled charter, and you see a theory of consent and coercion that later ages will argue, line by line. Big claims draw headlines, small rules change lives. Return to England and close the loop we left open. The charter he struck down is not a tombstone, it is a seed. It germinates in rebellion, drought, and negotiation. It changes words, shifts clauses, gathers glosses, and refuses to stay buried. His annulment was legally neat. History is not neat. A document meant to restrain a king grows teeth over time. A papal defense of feudal order becomes a foil for talk of rights. He won the case he was in. He lost the larger narrative. That dissonance is not failure. It is the usual fate of anyone who writes for the present with tools that outlive them. Return to the empire and open the loop we left there. The young prince he backed grows into a ruler whose curiosity charms and whose delays aggravate. Promises made in youth are treated as drafts in adulthood. The papal imperial dance becomes a long negotiation, scored in letters and diets, with truces and sharp turns. When people later say the two swords cannot share a sheath, they are quoting a frustration that this age made vivid. He did not settle the question of empire and papacy. He set its terms in phrases his successors would keep repeating. Look sideways to Rome itself. The city is not a stage, it is a stubborn actor. Communal government flexes, noble clans bargain. The Pope is a spiritual monarch with a city council at his gate and neighbors with towers. The Papal States are not a single color on a map. They are a patchwork of loyalties, tolls, and roads. Centralization on parchment meets autonomy in alleys. Administration travels by mule, and every mile invites friction. When you read of a legate empowered to correct abuses, remember the road dust and the local priest with cousins on the town council. Look again at the council and its shadows. It defined the Eucharist with a clarity that closed some debates and opened others. It made annual confession a habit and Easter communion a norm, which means it made conscience audible in new ways. It told clergy to preach regularly and to teach the basics of faith, which means it made doctrine more public. It tightened marriage into public, traceable form, which means it gave families tools to fight secret betrayals and forced unions. It tried to stop clerical misconduct with rules that would be copied for centuries. It also wrote lines that rulers would later turn into marks on coats and walls. Reform is not a potion, it is a kit. What people build with it depends on hands you cannot control. If you need a test case in rumor versus act, visit a smaller legend that clings to his years like ivy. Children walk across Europe carrying crosses and singing, an unplanned tide with no ships and many storytellers. Later ages will call it a crusade. Some will call it a hoax. The paperwork of the time tries to guide, protect, and dismiss in the same breath. He did not summon this zeal. He tried to keep it from breaking the frame. Not every movement in an age of faith starts at the pulpit. Some start in fields and alleys and make the pulpit react. The tools he refined left marks that outlast banners. Canon law students copy his letters into collections that will become the skeleton of later books. Bishops learn that appeals can jump borders and land in Rome with predictable forms. Parish priests learn that preaching schedules and confession lines are not just pious habits, but obligations with teeth. Monarchs learn that a pen can wound pride more effectively than a sword, and that a wedding can be a lawsuit waiting to happen if it is not sung in the right way, before the right eyes. If you want a single image to hold, stand in a church he never saw, and listen. A priest tells people to confess annually and communicates them at Easter. A couple stands before witnesses and binds a marriage in words that are law as well as vow. A bishop preaches because he is told to, not because he feels like it. These are not museum pieces. They are the residue of a council he drove, habits that outlasted sieges and parades. Now return to the first question. Who rules the rulers? He answered with scripture and law. God above, the church as steward, the Pope as judge when conscience and crown collide. The age he knew largely accepted that answer in form, if not always in fact. The ages that followed will argue it, borrowing his language to fight him and to defend him. That is how influence works when it is real. It supplies the vocabulary for later dissent. When reformers want to restrain papal claims, they will quote his terms. When defenders want to shore them up, they will quote the same lines with a different emphasis. He supplied both sides with their grammar. He dies, away from Rome, with unfinished business stacked in the inbox. The council's canons are still fresh in pulpits. The emperor he backed is still a youth with a dangerous mind. The crusade he scheduled will sail without him and meet its own arithmetic. Power always leaves mid-sentence. The measure is not whether the sentence ended neatly, but whether the grammar it taught kept being used. So does calling him the most powerful pope help? Only if you hear the hum under the headline. Power here is not thunder. It's a system of paper and habit, of penalties that mute bells and permissions that bless barefoot preachers, of councils that fold doctrine into domestic life. It is also a record of overreach and cost. Cities in the south tightened by crusade, Christians in the east with long memories of Latin boots, a charter branded void that refused to stay buried. He did not draw Europe with a bold line. He nudged its margins until old shapes looked different. The safer claim is smaller and truer. He made law audible. He tuned Europe to a tempo the church set, and convinced rulers that conscience could be compelled by calendar, by court, by quiet. The tune did not last untouched. It never does. But for 2 decades, a young lawyer from the Campagna wrote measures others would dance to, even when they hated the song. Watch how the pieces fit when you stop looking for statues and start reading soot. Interdicts do not smash doors. They leave them shut and let the silence do the work. Crusade preaching does not just lift swords, it lifts ledgers and timetables. Councils do not end arguments with thunder, they end them with sentences that parish priests repeat until the habit sticks. Marriage law does not merely bless, it binds kings to rules they cannot bend without going to court. New religious life does not explode institutions, it slides into them through permissions that look small until cities feel different. You don't have to like him to learn from him. Read the silences where bells didn't ring, the clauses that still govern marriages, the letters that tried and failed to steer armies, the approvals that let new holiness inside without tearing the roof off. The legend says he ruled kings, the record says he ruled rhythms, and rhythms, once taught, keep time long after the conductor leaves the hall.